Greetings, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. We appreciate you tuning in. If you've been listening, then you know that we've been doing these short messages on the Ten Commandments. We've been trying to cover each commandment, and today we're on commandment number 5. And let's read that. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and it says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you." And I may have mentioned this before, but I'd like to say it again. You know, there were 2 tablets, and so the commandments are divided up into two parts. The first 4 have to do with our relationship with God, and then the last 6, that would be 5 through 10, have to do with our relationship with one another. I've heard people say it and explain it like this, that these commandments are both vertical and horizontal. That is to say, they're vertical, having to do with God from us and us to God, but they're also horizontal, having to do with one another. And today we've entered into that part where it's the horizontal commandments, or the commandments that relate to our relationships with each other. Now this is gonna seem kind of strange, or it seems like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I want to say that I do love the commandments, but I would just say this, that there's not one of the commandments that I haven't broken. So that may not sound exactly right to you. It would say someone loves the commandments and yet they've not been able to keep them, but I have great admiration for the commandments of God, and the reason I do is because they're for our welfare. They're very important, and for the welfare of our whole society. So there's great value. In fact, the psalmist said in Psalm 119, 127, he said, "Therefore I love your commandments more," he said, "more than gold, yes, than fine gold." Now, why would he say that God's commandments mean so much to him, even more than he puts value on gold? And again, it's because they're meant for our well-being. God's intent in giving the commandments were for us. They were for our benefit. And we may have thought, and I probably have done this sometimes in my past, hopefully it hadn't been in a long time, but we may have thought that God gives orders and commands because he can. Or we might say because he has the power and he has the control to do that. And so we may have a tendency to think that God, when he gives these commands, he gives them arbitrarily. That is to say, at just a whim. But I want to mention this. We think that, and we have those thoughts. And the reason why is because of our ignorance of God and what he's like. If I could describe God in 3 words, I would describe God, number 1, as being love, because the Bible says God is love. I would say love describes him. I would say his holiness describes him, and then I would probably put in there the word power. So I think that those 3 things describes God. So God is love, and we need to understand that everything that God does is motivated by love. Now, let's get back to our commandment. Now, the commandment, we're commanded to honor our father and mother, and the reason why is because it's just the right thing to do. And you might ask the question, how do we know what's right? And that's a good question. I think it's something that we ought to ask. We could say that we know because of our conscience, but our consciences are flawed because of the sin that we have, the inherent sin that we have. And so the answer to the question is, how do we know what's right and how do we know what's wrong? It comes from God. God tells us what's right and what's wrong because he's the perfect judge of all of that. So why are we supposed to honor our mother and father? Just because it's the right thing to do. And there are no exceptions. Sometimes we may think, well, you don't know my mother and you don't know my father, but there's no qualifications put on this commandment, whether our fathers or mothers are good or whether they're not good. Now, Paul listed something that was kind of interesting when he listed the prevailing attitudes that will be in the end times. And he mentions that in 2 Timothy chapter 3. There's a whole list of them, of the prevailing attitudes that mankind will have. And I think it's interesting to know that one of those attitudes would be disobedient to parents. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can dishonor our parents. And I know that Jesus mentioned it when he spoke to the Pharisees. He said about the Pharisees that they were breaking this commandment when they failed to care and to provide for their parents. Now, they used some kind of religious tradition that they had. They had this tradition that if they had money and they had set aside this money and designated to God, then they wouldn't have to use it to help their parents. And Jesus said that by their traditions they were breaking this commandment. So there's a lot of different ways that we can honor our parents. But I would just say this: that the best way to fulfill this commandment is to honor the Lord. I mean, if we honor the Lord and we put Him first, then honoring our parents will just follow that. And not only will honoring our parents follow that, but honoring and caring about our spouses and our children and our neighbor. It'll just all follow from that. Now the New Testament has brought out an interesting point about this commandment, and it said this, that it's the first commandment that comes with a promise attached to it. Now maybe you knew that. Now you might ask, well, what is the promise that's attached to it? And the promise is this: it's long life. That's the promise that comes with this commandment. God says, honor your fathers and your mothers that your days may be long. Now, let me just kind of put a caveat in that. There are certainly ways that things that we can do, bad decisions, living the wrong type of life, taking chances, just doing things we shouldn't be doing, that can shorten our lives. But I want you to notice the implication in this promise. Now, God promised that if we honored our father and mothers, that we would have a long life. So implied in that commandment is simply this, that God determines the number of our days that we have. Our lives are in His hand. And Moses, he had a great thing to say in Psalm 90. Psalm 90 is a psalm of Moses. And he said, so teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So that's a good thing to think about. Now, the fifth commandment, which talks about honoring our mother and father, is also mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. And in that reference, in Deuteronomy, it says something else. Let me read this to you. It says that your days may be long and that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So by keeping this command, there's a promise that's twofold. The first part of the promise is that we're promised long life. And the second part, according to Deuteronomy 5:16, the second part of that is that it may be well with us. And who doesn't want things to be well with us? Who wouldn't want that while we live our lives down here below? So this commandment doesn't say that if our parents deserve it. Now, some people like to say, well, I would do that, but my parents don't really deserve it. It doesn't say that, because that doesn't have anything to do with it. We're still to honor our mother and father. And as I mentioned earlier, the best way that we can honor them is to give our own lives to the Lord. When we give our lives to Jesus, or give our lives to the one that God sent to save us, then that things begin to kind of straighten out, and the right priorities seem to happen in our life, and we can have a different perspective on things. So I would just recommend this. If you really would like to keep this commandment, then honor the Lord. Give your life to the Lord, and then you'll feel differently if you have harsh feelings or bad feelings about your parents. I don't know if you do or not. You probably love them and adore them, and this commandment's not that hard for you to do. But anyway, it's an important commandment, and it has a promise with it that we'll live long and that things will be well with us. I hope that this has been helpful to you. Hope it's been an encouragement to you. And again, we want to say that we appreciate you listening and tuning in. Hope you have a really good week this week, and stay safe, and God bless you.